The morning Elena discovered the affair, she was standing in her own kitchen wearing a silk robe she'd bought with money from the architectural firm she'd built from nothing, holding a phone that showed her husband of 15 years, kissing a 26-year-old junior associate in the parking garage of the building Elena's designs had made famous. She didn't scream or throw the phone or confront him when he came home that evening smelling of another woman's perfume. She simply smiled, served him the dinner she'd prepared, and began planning his destruction with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her one of the most sought-after architects in the city. Marcus had always underestimated her, even as he'd climbed the ranks of his investment firm on the foundation of her salary, her connections, her ability to charm clients at dinner parties while he drank too much and told the same stories. She'd put him through business school while working 70-hour weeks at a firm that paid her less than her male colleagues. She'd smiled through his mother's subtle criticisms, his friends' wandering eyes at parties, his gradual transformation from the earnest graduate student she'd married into a man who checked his reflection in every passing window. When he finally asked for the divorce 6 months later, Elena's lawyer was already prepared with documentation of every asset, every account, every investment she'd funded while he built his career on her back. The settlement gave him half of everything, as the law demanded, and he took it with a smile that told her he thought he'd won. Marcus moved into a downtown penthouse with Amber, the girl from the parking garage, the one with the yoga body and the business degree from a state school, and the habit of ending sentences with a questioning uptick that made every statement sound like she was asking permission to exist. Elena watched from a coffee shop across the street as they moved in together, Marcus's hand on Amber's ass as they waited for the elevator, and she felt nothing but a cold, crystalline clarity. She'd built him once. Now she would unmake him piece by piece, and he would never even know her hand was behind his unraveling. The first year was about foundation work, the invisible infrastructure that would support everything that came after. Elena joined the same gym as Amber, timing her visits to coincide with the younger woman's morning yoga classes. She didn't approach immediately, just existed in the same space, offering the occasional smile, the brief nod of recognition. She learned Amber's routine, her preferences, the instructors she favored. She noticed how Amber always arrived early, how she stretched in the same corner, how she checked her phone obsessively between poses, that vertical line of anxiety appearing between her eyebrows whenever Marcus didn't respond immediately. Elena recognized that look. She'd worn it herself once in the early years when she was still naive enough to believe that loving someone harder could make them love you back. By month 3, they were nodding acquaintances. By month 6, they were sharing the occasional comment about class difficulty or instructor style. Elena never mentioned Marcus, never acknowledged that she knew anything about Amber beyond their gym interactions. She was simply Elena, a successful architect with a warm smile and an easy manner, someone who made Amber feel seen in a way that Marcus, increasingly absorbed in his work and his new circle of younger friends, apparently did not. When Amber finally mentioned her boyfriend in passing, complaining lightly about his long hours, Elena made sympathetic noises and suggested coffee sometime. Nothing pushy, just the casual offer of one woman to another. Amber accepted with an eagerness that told Elena everything she needed to know about how lonely the girl already was. While she cultivated Amber, Elena began the careful work of dismantling Marcus's professional life. She knew his firm, knew the partners, knew the delicate ecosystem of egos and alliances that governed every investment bank. She'd met them all at countless dinner parties, had listened to their boring stories and laughed at their terrible jokes, and remembered every detail because that was what Marcus's success had required of her. Now she used that knowledge. She had lunch with Patricia Chen, a partner who'd always resented Marcus's rapid advancement and mentioned casually that she'd heard troubling rumors about some of Marcus's client relationships. Nothing specific, nothing she could be sued for, just the seed of doubt planted in fertile ground. Patricia listened with the sharp attention of a woman who'd been waiting for ammunition. She called Thomas Rivera, another partner, and expressed concern about some irregularities she'd noticed in their joint accounts before the divorce. Numbers that didn't quite add up, transactions that seemed questionable. Again, nothing explicit, nothing provable, just enough to make Thomas wonder if Marcus was as clean as he appeared. She knew how these men thought, how they valued loyalty but feared liability above all else. Every conversation was brief, carefully calibrated, designed to leave an impression without leaving evidence. She never said anything actionable, never made direct accusations, just asked questions with a worried tone and let their paranoia do the rest. She was a concerned ex-wife, nothing more. Someone who discovered troubling things in the wreckage of her marriage and felt obligated to mention them. However uncomfortable that might be, Marcus's work began to suffer in small ways. He lost a major client to a competitor, the kind of loss that happens sometimes in finance, but rarely to someone with his track record. His expense reports were suddenly subject to additional scrutiny. He was passed over for a promotion he'd been promised, told the timing wasn't right, that the partners wanted to see more consistent performance. Elena watched from a distance as the stress began to show in his face, the way his smile became tighter at firm events, the way he drank more at the networking dinners he used to dominate. She'd learned the rhythm of his professional life over 15 years of marriage, knew exactly where the pressure points were, and she applied pressure with surgical precision in the second year. Elena's coffee dates with Amber became regular occurrences. They met twice a week at a place near Amber's office, and Elena listened with apparent sympathy as the younger woman complained about Marcus's mood swings, his increasing irritability, the way he snapped at her over small things and then apologized with expensive gifts that felt like bribes. Elena never criticized Marcus directly, never encouraged Amber to leave him, just listened and asked gentle questions that made Amber articulate her own doubts. She was good at this, the careful emotional manipulation, because she'd learned from the best. Marcus had spent years making her question her own perceptions, gaslighting her about his late nights at work and his unexplained expenses. And now she used those same techniques with precision and purpose. She told Amber stories from her own past, carefully edited versions that cast Marcus in an increasingly unflattering light without seeming to attack him. She mentioned his drinking, framing it as a concern rather than a criticism. She talked about his relationship with his mother, the way he'd always prioritized his family's expectations over their partnership. She described his pattern of pursuing younger women, not just Amber, but others before Elena, a history that made Amber's position seem less special and more predictable. Every revelation was delivered with reluctance, with the air of someone who didn't want to speak ill of her ex, but felt obligated to be honest with a friend. Amber absorbed it all with growing unease, and Elena could see the doubt taking root, could see the girl beginning to question whether she'd won a prize or inherited a problem at the same time. Elena began working on Marcus's credit. She knew his social security number, his mother's maiden name, all the security question answers from years of managing their joint finances. She opened credit cards in his name at stores he'd never shop at, made small purchases that he wouldn't notice immediately, then missed payments deliberately. She signed him up for services and subscriptions that charged monthly fees, using email addresses similar to, but not exactly his own, ensuring the bills went to collections before he even knew they existed. She was careful, methodical, never doing enough at once to trigger immediate alarms, but creating a steady drip of financial chaos that would compound over time. His credit score began to fall, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum. And she knew he wouldn't notice until he tried to make a major purchase or refinance something. She also began a whisper campaign among his social circle, the younger crowd he'd adopted after leaving her, the friends who valued him for his money and his connections rather than any genuine affection. She created a fake social media profile, a composite of several real people, and began commenting on posts, liking photos, inserting herself into the digital periphery of their world. She spread rumors carefully, never about Marcus directly, but about the firm, about financial troubles, about investigations that weren't actually happening but sounded plausible, enough to make people nervous about their association with him. She posted articles about investment fraud, tagged them in ways that created algorithmic connections to Marcus's name, polluted the digital space around him with suggestions of impropriety. When people searched for him online, they found these breadcrumbs, these hints of scandal. And even though there was nothing concrete, the association was enough to make them cautious. By the third year, Marcus had been demoted. Not fired, not yet, but moved to a less prestigious division with fewer clients and lower commissions. He'd fought it, Elena heard through her remaining connections at the firm, had argued and even threatened legal action. But ultimately, the partners had presented him with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. His relationship with Amber had grown strained. The easy chemistry of the affair replaced by the grinding reality of daily life with a man whose professional identity was crumbling and who had no idea how to process failure. Elena knew this because Amber told her everything over their coffee dates. Crying sometimes, asking Elena's advice about whether she should stay or go. Whether Marcus was really the man she thought he was, Elena played her role perfectly. The wise older woman who'd survived Marcus and come out stronger, who could offer perspective without judgment. She never told Amber to leave. Instead, she shared stories about her own journey to independence, about how liberating it had been to discover who she was without Marcus's needs dictating her choices. She talked about therapy and self-care and the importance of not losing yourself in someone else's chaos. She modeled the life Amber could have if she chose differently, and she watched as Amber began to pull away from Marcus, not dramatically but incrementally, creating distance in the way she responded to his moods, setting boundaries he didn't respect, starting to build the emotional scaffolding for an exit. Elena was patient. She'd waited this long. She could wait longer. She continued her assault on Marcus's finances and reputation with the same methodical patience. She'd learned through Amber that Marcus was trying to start his own investment fund, that he'd been quietly reaching out to potential investors, pitching himself as an independent operator with insider expertise. Elena made sure those conversations went nowhere. She called old clients, expressed concern about Marcus's judgment, mentioned the troubles at his firm, suggested that perhaps now wasn't the right time to trust him with their money. She posed as a potential investor herself, using a shell company and a lawyer as intermediary, scheduled meetings with Marcus and then canceled at the last minute with vague excuses that wasted his time and made him seem desperate. She left reviews online for his services, nothing that could be proven false, but enough to poison the well, to make anyone who searched for him think twice. His credit continued to deteriorate as the fraudulent accounts went into collections and the damage compounded. He couldn't get approved for the business loan he needed to launch his fund. His car was repossessed one morning in front of his building, a humiliation that Amber witnessed and reported to Elena with obvious distress. His landlord informed him that his lease wouldn't be renewed because of concerns about his ability to pay rent, a decision Elena had ensured by anonymously sending documentation of his credit problems to the property management company. Marcus's world was shrinking, and he had no idea who to blame because everything seemed like random bad luck, unconnected incidents that just happened to be occurring in rapid succession. He never suspected Elena, who had been unfailingly polite in their few necessary interactions, who had never shown anger or vindictiveness, who had simply moved on with her life. By the fourth year, Amber left him. She told Elena about it before she told Marcus, sitting in their usual coffee shop with tears running down her face, explaining that she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't watch him destroy himself, couldn't sacrifice her own peace for someone who seemed determined to fail. Elena held her hand and said all the right things about how difficult but necessary this decision was. How proud she was of Amber for choosing herself. How Marcus would be okay eventually, but that wasn't Amber's responsibility anymore. She helped Amber find a new apartment, recommended a lawyer, offered support that felt genuine because in a strange way it was. She didn't hate Amber. The girl had been a tool, nothing more. And Elena had used her with the same cool efficiency she brought to every aspect of this project. Marcus's response to the breakup was predictable. He called Elena, drunk and crying, asking her what he'd done wrong, how everything had fallen apart so completely. She listened with apparent sympathy, made understanding noises, suggested he might benefit from therapy or a career counselor. She was kind in a distant way, the kindness of someone who'd moved beyond the pain he'd caused her. And that kindness was more devastating than anger would have been, because it highlighted how completely she'd let him go. He asked if they could meet for coffee, talk about old times, maybe explore whether they'd made a mistake in divorcing. She declined gently, said she'd moved on, and he should too, that dwelling on the past wasn't healthy for either of them. He begged, actually begged, and she felt a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, but was mostly just cold recognition of a project nearing completion. She accelerated her timeline then, sensing weakness, moving in for the final stages of demolition. She ensured his firm fired him completely by arranging for one of his former clients to threaten a lawsuit for mismanagement of funds, a claim that was baseless but required investigation. And the partners decided Marcus was more liability than asset. She made sure he knew about Amber's new boyfriend, a younger man who worked in tech and had the easy confidence Marcus had lost, by having them photographed at a restaurant where Marcus used to take her. She sent the photo anonymously to his email with no message, just the image of Amber laughing with someone new, happy in a way she'd never been with Marcus toward the end. She wanted him to know that Amber hadn't just left him, but had replaced him, upgraded, moved on without looking back. His mother stopped taking his calls after. Elena sent her a carefully crafted letter expressing concern about Marcus's drinking and his financial problems, suggesting that perhaps his family needed to intervene before things got worse. The letter was compassionate and worried. Exactly the kind of thing a concerned ex-wife might write, and it had the intended effect of making his mother ashamed of him, adding family disappointment to his professional and romantic failures. His friends drifted away as the rumors about his finances and his instability spread, as he became the guy who always needed to borrow money, or who brought down the mood at gatherings with his complaints and his drinking. His social media presence, once vibrant with posts about success and adventure, became sparse and then silent as he had nothing left to brag about and no energy to pretend. In the fifth year, Elena watched from a careful distance as Marcus hit bottom. He'd moved into a studio apartment in a marginal neighborhood, was working a sales job that barely covered his rent, had gained weight and lost the carefully maintained appearance that had once defined him. She saw him sometimes in the city, always alone, always with that hunched posture of defeat, and she felt nothing but a distant satisfaction. The way an architect might feel seeing a condemned building finally demolished to make way for something better. He'd taken everything from her once, had gutted the life she'd built, and walked away with half the proceeds and a younger woman on his arm, and the Confidence of a man who believed he deserved it all. Now he had nothing, and he didn't even understand how it had happened. Couldn't trace the invisible threads that led back to her. Couldn't comprehend that his destruction had been engineered with the same precision she brought to her architectural designs. She'd rebuilt her own life during these 5 years, had poured the energy she might have wasted on grief or anger into her career instead. She'd started her own firm, taken the clients who'd always preferred working with her anyway, designed buildings that won awards, and made her name synonymous with innovation and excellence. She'd traveled, had taken the trips she'd always wanted, but Marcus had dismissed as impractical. She'd dated, nothing serious, but enough to remember what it felt like to be desired by someone who actually saw her. She'd bought a house with a view of the water, decorated it exactly as she'd always wanted without compromise or negotiation. She'd become the person she might have been if she'd never met Marcus. If she'd never wasted 15 years making a mediocre man feel exceptional. On the 5th anniversary of the day, she'd found the photo of Marcus kissing Amber in the parking garage. Elena sent him a package. Inside was a single photograph, professionally shot, showing her standing in front of her latest building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that dominated the skyline, her arms crossed and her smile confident and genuine. She was wearing a dress that cost more than his monthly rent, standing beside the mayor who commissioned the building, surrounded by evidence of her success and her satisfaction. On the back of the photo, she'd written in her elegant handwriting, "Thank you for the motivation." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. He would no doubt Marcus received the package on a Tuesday evening in his studio apartment, where the walls were thin enough to hear his neighbors fighting, and the ceiling leaked when it rained. He opened it carefully, perhaps expecting legal documents or some final piece of divorce paperwork, and when he saw the photograph, his hands began to shake. He stared at it for a long time, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand how Elena had gone from the crying woman he left to this poised, powerful figure in the image. He turned it over, read the message, read it again, and something in his chest cracked as he finally understood that his downfall hadn't been bad luck or coincidence, but calculated revenge. Years in the making, executed with a precision he'd never been capable of matching. He called her number, the one he'd memorized during their marriage and never deleted despite everything, but it was disconnected. He tried her email and it bounced back. He searched for her online and found her firm's website, saw the glowing reviews and the prestigious projects and the photos of her at charity galas and industry events. Always smiling, always surrounded by evidence of her success. He tried to remember when it had all started going wrong for him, when the first domino had fallen, but he couldn't pinpoint it because she'd been so careful, so patient, so thorough in her dismantling of his life that there was no single moment of rupture, just a slow unraveling that had seemed like his own failure rather than her design. He thought about the promotions he'd lost, the clients who'd walked away, the credit cards he'd never applied for but somehow existed in his name, the rumors that had spread through his professional network like a virus. He thought about Amber and how she'd grown distant, how their relationship had soured in ways that seemed natural at the time but in retrospect felt orchestrated. He thought about the coffee shop where Amber used to meet a friend twice a week, a friend she'd talked about with growing frequency and admiration. And he wondered now if that friend had been Elena, if his ex-wife had been there all along, poisoning his relationship from the inside while he remained oblivious. The realization was crushing, not because of what Elena had done, but because of how completely he'd underestimated her, how thoroughly he'd failed to see her as anything more than the foundation he'd built his life upon and then discarded when something shinier caught his attention. He sat on his secondhand couch in his dim apartment with the photograph in his hands, and finally understood that this was it, that there would be no recovery, no redemption arc, no heroic comeback story. Elena had won not by destroying him in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but by methodically erasing him from the life he'd stolen from her, by reclaiming everything he'd taken and building something better while he spiraled downward. She'd won by becoming someone he could never reach, never touch, never hurt again, someone who'd transformed the pain he'd caused her into fuel for her own ascension. She'd won by making him irrelevant, and that was the most brutal revenge of all, because it meant she'd stopped thinking about him. Long before he'd stopped thinking about her dog, he wanted to be angry, but couldn't find the energy for it. Wanted to plot his own revenge, but recognized the absurdity of that thought, because what could he possibly do to someone who'd already taken everything and left him with nothing? He'd been a successful man once, handsome and confident and sure of his place in the world, and now he was whatever this was. This diminished version of himself sitting alone in a shitty apartment staring at a photograph of his ex-wife thriving without him. The worst part was knowing that Elena hadn't even enjoyed destroying him, that it had been simply another project, another design problem to solve with careful planning and methodical execution. He'd been incidental to his own destruction, just as he'd made her incidental to his happiness during their marriage. And the symmetry of it was almost poetic. Marcus set the photograph on his coffee table, where he would see it every day, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd become. And he poured himself a drink from the cheap whiskey bottle he kept in his kitchen. He drank it slowly, tasting the bitterness, feeling it burn on the way down, and he wondered if Elena was somewhere right now thinking about him at all, or if she'd simply moved on to new projects, new challenges, new triumphs that had nothing to do with the man she'd once loved and now had perfectly. Completely, irrevocably defeated. He suspected it was the latter, suspected that she'd sent the photograph not as a taunt, but as a closing statement, a final period at the end of their story that made clear he was no longer even worth her attention. She'd dismantled his life with the casual efficiency of someone demolishing a building to make room for something better. And now she was done with him, finished, ready to focus on the things that actually mattered. The photograph remained on his coffee table for weeks, then months, accumulating dust and coffee rings, a constant presence in his shrinking world. He looked at it sometimes when he couldn't sleep, when the weight of his failures pressed down too heavily, when he needed to remember that his suffering hadn't been random but earned, deserved, the logical consequence of his choices. He thought he was the hero of his own story, the successful man trading up for a younger model, pursuing happiness as was his right. And Elena had shown him that he'd actually been the villain in hers, the obstacle she'd needed to overcome, the problem she'd needed to solve. She'd solved him completely, and the evidence of her solution stared at him every day from that table. Beautiful and smiling and utterly untouchable. Years later, when Marcus finally scraped together enough money to move to a different city and try to start over, he left most of his possessions behind because they reminded him of his failure, and he wanted to believe he could reinvent himself somewhere no one knew his history. But he took the photograph with him, tucked it into his suitcase along with his few clothes and his laptop and the other essentials of his diminished life. He told himself it was because he needed to remember, needed to carry the lesson of what happened when you underestimated someone, when you took without considering the cost, when you believed your own success mattered more than the people you'd stepped on to achieve it. But really he kept it because it was the last connection he had to Elena, to the life they'd shared, to the man he'd been before she'd systematically destroyed him. And some part of him couldn't let go of that, even though holding on meant carrying his own execution around with him wherever he went. Elena never thought about the photograph after she sent it. Never wondered if Marcus had received it or what his reaction might have been. Never felt the need to confirm that her message had landed. She'd said what she needed to say, delivered her final judgment, and then moved on completely because that was the ultimate victory. The ability to forget him as thoroughly as he'd once dismissed her. She attended gallery openings and gave keynote speeches and mentored young architects and dated interesting people and traveled to beautiful places. And sometimes months would pass without Marcus crossing her mind at all because he simply didn't matter anymore. Had become a footnote in the story of her life rather than its defining chapter. When friends asked her about her ex-husband, as they occasionally did, she would smile in that enigmatic way she'd perfected and say that things had worked out exactly as they should have. But sometimes losing everything was the only way to discover what you were actually capable of becoming. They took it as a story about her resilience, her ability to rebuild after betrayal, and she let them believe that because it was partly true and the whole truth was something she kept to herself. A secret satisfaction that lived quietly in the center of her chest like a small, perfect diamond. She'd loved Marcus once, genuinely and completely, and that love had transformed into something else when he betrayed it. Something colder and sharper and infinitely more powerful than the emotion that had preceded it. She'd proven what she'd always suspected, that she was capable of anything when properly motivated, that the skills she'd developed building structures could be applied just as effectively to destroying a life, that patience and planning and precision could achieve results that rage never could. Marcus had given her the greatest gift, though he'd never meant to, which was the absolute clarity of purpose that comes from being wronged, so thoroughly that revenge becomes not a choice but a necessity. Not about getting even, but about proving who you are when stripped of everything you thought defined you. She'd become the person she needed to be, and in the process she'd erased him from her life more completely than any divorce decree could have managed. Had reduced him to a memory that surfaced only rarely and then faded just as quickly. Like a dream you can barely remember upon waking, the city skyline still bore her mark. Building after building that testified to her talent and her vision. And she would add more in the years to come because she was just beginning, just hitting her stride, just discovering the full scope of what she could accomplish when no one was holding her back or taking credit or making her smaller to make himself feel larger. Marcus's destruction had been necessary, but it hadn't been the point, hadn't been the goal. Had simply been the clearing of space that allowed her to build something beautiful where his mediocrity had once stood. She'd won not because she'd beaten him, but because she'd transcended him. Had become someone operating on a level he couldn't even comprehend, much less reach. And so Elena continued living her life with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her revenge. Building structures that would last centuries, mentoring the next generation of architects, traveling and loving and experiencing everything she denied herself during those 15 years, off marriage to a man who'd never deserved her,